Welcome to the International Symposium on Alternatives Assessment Virtual 2020 Symposium on Current Practices and Future Prospects. We'd like to thank our sponsors for their generous contributions to making this symposium possible. The Washington State Department of Ecology, the State of Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, Seventh Generation, and Martin Wolf from Seventh Generation is on today's webinar, Angus Chemical Company, and Tox Services. So this is the fifth session of our International Symposium, and it's a part of a two-part session today, the second part starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This part is about considering uncertainty and the strategies to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. As we know, many of the decisions we make about choosing a safer alternative involve limited data. And we need to make those decisions nonetheless. So what are the ways we think about that and do that? We're gonna just go to introducing actually our moderator for today's session. Professor Tim Malloy is a professor at the UCLA School of Law. Tim has been a pioneer in the field of alternatives assessment, has been one of our greatest champions of the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment and on its executive committee. And Tim is just a fantastic human being wanting to move safer chemicals forward. So Tim, welcome, and thank you so much for facilitating today's discussion.
Hey, thanks, Joel. Hello, everybody, and good morning. And when I say good morning, I mean morning for those of us on the West Coast and folks elsewhere in the world who may be facing challenges of super early mornings. I invite you to have your coffee. Not that you'll need help staying awake because we've got some terrific panel presentations for today. As Joel mentioned, this panel is about uncertainty. And look, we can't make a special claim to uncertainty in alternatives assessment. I mean, uncertainty is pervasive, right? Even with respect to conventional types of risk assessment, hazard assessment, risk management. And the good news is because it is so pervasive, there's a variety of kind of time-tested techniques for dealing with uncertainty, as well as emerging, cutting-edge approaches to dealing with uncertainty. But I think it's fair to say that in the alternatives assessment world, the problems of uncertainty can be exacerbated, right? Because when we're doing these comparative analyses, what we're typically looking at is not only perhaps a well-studied incumbent chemical material process, but also some alternatives to that, many of which may not have been so closely studied. And that just amplifies the problem of uncertainty, right? Because now we've got to manage uncertainty within each of these and across these. So we wanted to put together a panel that got at this. And we wanted it to be, a panel both informed by the, principles and theories and, sophisticated methodologies, but also on the ground practice, like what's actually happening on the ground, in the weeds, so forth. So we brought in a few really top folks who are struggling with these issues in the real world. But I have to say, we've also got, I'd say, probably about 80 other experts in one way or on the other on uncertainty. That is you, all the participants. And, chances are we could have walked out into this virtual room and pulled any one of you and put you up on a panel and learned a lot about managing uncertainty. So in fact, that's exactly what we're going to do today. So we're going to have our panel presentation. They're going to talk to us about some particular approaches, particular case studies, talk to us about their views on uncertainty. But we also want you to be involved in this. So can I get the next slide there? So, they say question and answer goes both ways. And here we're actually going to do that. We'd like you, as you're listening to the presentations, to be thinking about these three questions. First, what do you do to address uncertainty in your assessments or in your work, right? And what lessons would you pass on to this community? So we've asked the panelists to think about these questions and think about the lessons that they have to share, and we're very anxious to hear them. But we hope that during the question and answer discussion period after the panel presentation, that you'll engage with the panel and you'll also share with us the lessons you have to pass on. And then lastly, we're about the advancement of alternatives assessment. So we're also looking to address this kind of institutional, one might say, question, which is our practice in our community of practice coalescing around specific strategies? Should it be coalescing around specific strategies? So these are the things we'd like you to be thinking about. And we'll challenge you during the question and answer period to become active presenters of your own. So Molly is going to take a copy of these questions and drop them into the chat. So, as things are going on, if you want to refer back to what is it they wanted me to think about, you'll be able to see that in the chat. And so we're hoping that kind of gives you a jumpstart into a very active Q&A session. And let me just say, as the presentations are going on, please feel free, as a question comes to your mind, to drop that in the chat as well. We'll monitor that and we'll try to integrate those questions into the Q&A period towards the end, right? So ask your questions whenever you like by using the chat. So on to our panel. Our first panelist is Martin Wolf. And Dr. Wolf is the Director of Authenticity and Sustainability at Seventh Generation. And he works there to create frameworks for design of sustainable household and personal care products. And I think that's really kind of captures the core of what Martin is about. I'm going to pass it on to him and let you explain to what he's been doing in his own words. Thanks for joining us, Martin.
Thank you very much, Tim. So what I hope to do in this presentation is bring to this community a challenge that Seventh Generation faced and frankly still faces in terms of designing a product. And in the next slide, I outline my presentation, which begins with a introduction to Seventh Generation, because as you'll hear, who you are as a company or perhaps as an individual, but certainly the organization you work for, has a lot to do in how you deal with uncertainty and the strategies you can bring to bear. That reflects in our product design philosophy, which I'll discuss, and our approach to risk management. And then I'll get into the specifics of the problem I'm going to discuss, the uncertainties that it held, and the decisions that we as a company made. So moving on to the next slide. For those of you who don't know Seventh Generation, we are a manufacturer of home care and personal care products. We make cleaning products. We make paper products from recycled fiber. We make some personal care products, baby diapers, baby wipes, and feminine hygiene products. In the next slide, we have our company mission, which is to transform the world into a healthy, sustainable, and equitable place for the next 7 generations. And the importance of this mission is that whenever we look at our supply chain, whenever we design a product, we ask, how is it helping us in this mission? Because if the product or the partnership that we take doesn't advance the mission, we have to ask ourselves, is it the right product or is it the right partnership? So in the next slide, we show Seventh Generation's product design philosophy in a Venn diagram. In the lower left-hand corner, you see cost and performance. And those, in fact, are variables that every company deals with, and in many ways is defined by the company approach. You might be a premium brand, in which case you're on shelf at a higher cost, and consumers expect you to have a higher level of performance. Conversely, you may be a company that views itself as offering excellent value. You're on shelf at a lower price, and you don't perform as well as a premium brand, but you perform sufficiently well that you have the consumer's confidence that your brand will meet his or her needs. So this is a trade-off that every company makes, or a balancing act that every company makes. And in addition, you're always using ingredients that have been vetted for their impacts on the environment and on human health. Make sure that the ingredients have been registered with the local authority, be that EPA or the FDA in the United States or under ECHA in Europe. And you at least meet the minimum requirements in those areas of health and environment. And as we all know as formulation chemists, when you change one of these areas, change one of these variables, often you impact the others. In the next slide, you have a very, very brief look at risk assessment. And we always consider the fact that a chemical or a product has some risk of harm that is a function of the hazard inherent in that chemical or product and the exposure to that chemical or product. And in the consumer marketplace, we can easily control the hazard. And if you click once, we can't always control the exposure. Consumers are notorious for finding very clever ways to use our products, and many of them are outside of what we would consider reasonable misuse of our products. Once a product gets into a consumer's hand, or more generally into the environment, a manufacturer's ability to control exposure diminishes. And if you hit the button again, for that reason, we like to focus on the hazard as a means of controlling risk rather than focusing on exposure. If you go to the next slide, you see what is our approach to managing hazards associated with our products, or I should say risk associated with our products. So if you click once, as I just said, we try to eliminate hazards to the greatest extent possible. And if you click again, if for some reason we can't eliminate a hazard, we then have to consider exposure, even though we recognize we have less control over it. So for example, if there is a contaminant present in our products that we cannot eliminate, we ask ourselves, what is the concentration? What is the likely exposure from use and reasonable reuse of our product? And we try to make the consequent risk as low as possible to accept that contaminant in our product. And then finally, if there's uncertainty about the exposure and we can't rule out for sure or to our satisfaction that we've sufficiently mitigated the risk, then we use precaution and say we won't use that ingredient, or we won't work with that particular form of a product. So that is our philosophical approach. Now let's get into a real life example. So about 6 years ago, a form of product was introduced into the marketplace, particularly for laundry detergents, called liquid unit dose packages. And the large blue arrow shows the increasing sales of this product of the years 2013 to 2018. And that upward trend makes this form of product extremely attractive to our marketers. They want to have this product in market. When these were first introduced, there were a large number of incidents reported in the press of children, particularly under 5 years of age, getting a hold of them and being injured, and in some very unfortunate circumstances, killed due to exposure to these liquid laundry packets. And the industry, to its very great credit, very rapidly saw the hazard that these represented and began to take steps to mitigate the risk of harm from the product. And the green arrow shows diminishing risk from use of these products. And seventh generation's marketing department said, well, we understand you wouldn't let us introduce this product several years ago, but look at the progress that has been made. Can we now introduce such a product? So on the next slide, we go into some very specific details about the increasing sales of this product. They went from 9% market share in 2013 to about 19% in 2018. So that's slightly more than doubling of share of the market. While the number of incidents due to exposure to these laundry packets, increased a mere 20%. So you can see that indeed the number of incidents per unit of sales of these products is diminishing. But if you look at incidents relative to the total market of laundry detergents, you see that they're actually fairly steady. And more important to me, looking at the sustainability of these products, you see what are called moderate or major outcomes. These are outcomes of an incident that result in hospitalization and cure, which is the moderate outcome, or permanent harm, which is a major outcome. And these are diminishing over time, even as sales increase. That's also a very good thing. But if you look again at the percentage relative to total laundry use, you see that the number of incidents is actually relatively constant, which I found interesting, but also concerning. So my premise to our marketing group was that if we could figure out a way to make these less hazardous so that we could control the risk of harm, then we can introduce such a product. And I also want to make a very important point here, and that is that these products are safe. They are in the marketplace. Manufacturers are meeting safety requirements. And though while we are talking about roughly 667 or so major or moderate outcomes in a year, you should recognize that there are roughly 6 billion uses of these products every year. So we're talking about a major incident in 1 out of every 10 million uses, which is certainly a low number. So the products certainly are safe. The question is, are they sufficiently safe to meet the standards that 7th generation has set for itself? So in the next slide is a quote from a 2019 study of the causes of harm, what the hazard is in these liquid laundry packets. And the line that struck me most importantly is that the mechanism of toxicity are not completely understood. It's very hard to control a hazard if you don't understand it. So there is the uncertainty in this. We don't know how to make a product safer. There are thoughts that some of the major ingredients in the product may be causing harm, but when I looked at the LD50 of conventional detergents versus the lethal dose, 50% of subjects saw very little difference between a standard laundry detergent and a liquid packet detergent. So there was something else going on that was just not understood. So the next slide goes to one way to manage the risk, which is, of course, to manage exposure. And this is the approach that resulted in those significant declines in risk of harm for the industry. Industry adopted in the United States a series of packaging and communications approaches that are mandated actually in Europe, are voluntary in the US, and that is to put these packets, which can be very attractive, in opaque packaging that is child resistant so that there's less chance of a child being exposed. They also required that the clear plastic film of the packet have an aversive agent so that there would be a very bitter taste, and a child would be likely to remove this from his or her mouth rather than bite into it. Enhanced burst strength for the film to make it harder to bite in and rupture the package, and a reduced rate of dissolution so the package could be in the child's mouth longer without losing strength. And there were a series of enhanced hazard warnings required on the package. So all of these things helped reduce the risk of harm by reducing the exposure without necessarily changing the fundamental hazard inherent in the product. And to go to the next slide, I bring back the tiered risk management that seventh generation uses. Eliminate the hazard. Well, we don't know how. There's too much uncertainty as to the cause of harm, so we couldn't do that. Consider exposure. We saw that the industry was doing that and doing a good job, but we still felt that there was so many more incidents with major outcomes that we were uncomfortable putting our brand name on that. So we used precaution and still have not introduced a liquid laundry packet into the marketplace. So the message I bring here is that an important aspect of dealing with uncertainty is knowing before you confront the uncertainty what your company's mission is, what your company's approach to risk is, and to have those in mind when you consider using a particular ingredient or introducing a particular product. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Martin. That was a very interesting and helpful presentation. And it, I guess when I look at what you presented, it brings to mind a list of strategies that the National Research Council had developed for how to deal with uncertainty. One of those was exclude alternatives with missing data. And it feels, if we had to generalize the strategy that you were implementing there, it sounds that it was a bit like that when you felt you couldn't fill in that gap, there was not enough data for you to make a judgment about hazard, you decided to exclude the alternative until there was enough information to make a decision that was consistent with your company's mission and values. Is that you think a fair characterization of this particular approach to uncertainty?
If you're asking me particularly, yes, I thought that was an excellent connection between the council's recommendation and our company's approach. So I wish I had seen that before so that I could have incorporated it.
Well, next time. But the other thing I want to say is, like, when we get into the question and answer period, I also want to maybe explore with you some of the other approaches that perhaps you've used and how you make the call between using one strategy versus another. And also that's something that maybe our participants today can be thinking about as well as our panelists. So we'll move on to our next presenter. So up next is Tom Lewandowski. Dr. Lewandowski is a toxicologist and a chemist. He works in Gradient's Seattle office. And Tom's been leading Gradient's efforts in the area of green chemistry and alternatives assessment, and has actually been involved in a couple of alternative assessments that have been, developed under the California Safer Consumer Products program. So I'll pass it on to you, Tom. And do you have your video on there, Tom?
I do, although I guess it says that I guess, oh yeah, okay. I guess Molly had to non-video me, and I had to do the same. Great.
All the magic in the background going on. Okay, Tom, the floor is yours.
It's so true. Thanks, Tim, for that nice introduction. So as Tim mentioned, I have sort of a foot in the risk assessment world and a foot in the alternative assessment world. And, in both places, I think the maybe typical way we approach uncertainty and understanding uncertainty is kind of a narrative discussion, right? So what are the possible sources of uncertainty and what do we think those sort of mean? But, in general, I think it is kind of limited to a qualitative discussion. But what I wanted to present here was maybe a more numerical way of looking at uncertainties and sort of maybe how that could be applied in the context of AA. So next slide. So the idea is to look at multiple variables simultaneously in a more quantitative way. So this is kind of a risk/AA-ish case example, some elements of both, but essentially we're dealing with kind of refrigerants and climate change. So this is some work we did a number of years ago. And until recently, or actually maybe until like 2014 to 2016, all automotive air conditioning systems around the world use tetrafluoroethane, which is also known as R134A, as the refrigerant in those air conditioning systems. The problem with that particular gas is that it's a potent greenhouse gas. It has a global warming potential of about 1,400 relative to CO2, so it's a significant concern. And one of the problems with this gas is its stability, right? So it has great properties both for performance as well as toxicity, because it really doesn't do much of anything. But it persists for a really long time because of that stability. So it doesn't degrade and can really reach the upper atmosphere where it can exert its greenhouse effect. And although obviously air conditioning systems are generally self-contained, the systems do leak slowly over time. And so you do have release of this chemical into the environment. And that's a particular concern from the automotive sector where, vehicles travel down bumpy roads and they have shocks and things like that that make the system somewhat leaky. So it is a concern. Now, under US law, and this really comes from the standpoint of ozone depletion, which was kind of an earlier concern, any replacement for this gas, this 134A, or any other sort of gas that has global warming potential, has to have an overall equivalent impact, right? So overall, the impacts of this material have to be similar between any replacement and the chemical you're trying to replace. So, that should sound familiar to some of you. But there is the potential for trade-offs among possible impacts. But in this case, and as many other cases, there's really no free lunch. We know that global warming potential, if we want to get that lower, we're going to have sort of less ideal outcomes for other hazards, right? So it's not that we can find an alternative that has, all the best possible features. There's going to have to be some trade-off involved. Next slide. So here's just kind of maybe an overall example of how the comparison goes. So we were looking at, again, our sort of main chemical was currently in use at the time, 134A, tetrafluoroethane, and two possible alternatives, carbon dioxide, which can itself be used as a refrigerant, as well as a new chemical, a fluoropropene called 1234YF. And just sort of looking across some of these different categories, in terms of human health toxicity, CO2 does have a slightly greater toxicity if you are sitting in an enclosed vehicle cabin and there's a leak and you get up to 40,000 parts per million, a huge concentration, but in an enclosed space, it's possible. You can have narcosis and that can cause you to have an accident. With the fluoropropene, the 1234YF, that's not going to happen until hundreds of thousands of ppm. It's just a very inert chemical, at least as far as the body goes. Ecological toxicity is pretty much the same. In terms of flammability, CO2 and the current chemical aren't flammable. 1234YF is weakly flammable. It can be ignited, although it takes a lot of energy to do that. They all have zero ozone depleting potential. Again, there's that huge difference in global warming potential. So we get a really big trade-off whether we switch to either of these alternatives. But then in terms of performance and technical feasibility, getting those CO2 systems to work, particularly in hot climates, is a challenge. They're not very efficient for hot climates in the mobile application. So you end up having poorer fuel economy, right? So you end up sort of having more CO2 emissions while using CO2 than you do with the 1234YF. So again, some things we need to trade off. Next slide. So, how did we determine what the proper alternative would be? So it was a multi-year process involving sort of global industry stakeholders who really came together to evaluate the merits of each of these alternatives. And the ultimate goal was really to look to see, in some sort of crash situation, right? When you have a vehicle collision or a leak due to some sort of decay of products or parts over time, what would the potential outcome be? Would that be CO2 exposure above a level of concern or some sort of ignition event from the refrigerants? And each of these assessments really had multiple factors involved. So you can think of things like, well, how severe was the crash, right? What was the geometry of the crash? Was the AC system even involved? Did we have aging of parts over time and how quickly did that occur? So, many, many variables, each of which had some of a certain uncertainty associated with them. And indeed, much of the analysis required expert judgment regarding some of these inputs to the assessment. And certainly one thing we discovered was that there were many different opinions involved. I mean, this was a group of just industry folks, right? And yet even there were really large differences of opinion. Those are based upon maybe differences of experience or differences in testing people had done, differences in philosophy, to some extent, differences in goals for where this assessment was supposed to go. And it became quickly very contentious. And what I discovered sort of leading this was that sensitivity analysis was one way to ensure that everyone's position was acknowledged and addressed, right? So people would sort of raise huge objections and I could say, well, we'll deal with that through the sensitivity analysis at the end. So that concern will be addressed. And that actually did a lot to really satisfy people's concerns. So I'll say a little bit more about how we did that on the next slide. So, when you want to do some sort of sensitivity analysis, certainly the easiest approach, and it's what a lot of people tend to do, including myself, is you simply redo the analysis, changing one value at a time to see what impact it had, right? So, you have one variable, whether it's the cost of an alternative or the performance of an alternative, and you make that slight change and you look at it and you see, well, does that really affect the outcome? But that may not be realistic in some cases because sometimes many of these assumptions are going to change sort of together, right? If you change this thing, if this thing varies by so much, then something else is likely to vary by a similar amount. So one way to deal with this is sort of a multivariate probabilistic sensitivity analysis that really then allows you to understand the range of uncertainties that might come about when you have multiple things sort of changing or varying based upon their uncertainty at the same time. And so to do that, you can ask experts to determine the ranges or probabilities for these key variables of interest. In this case, it was those with the least data or those that were expected to have the largest variability, right? Or those that were solely based on expert judgment, because we know that's somewhat uncertain. So we asked this group of stakeholders to sort of determine what the possible ranges for those variables would be and assigned probability distributions to those uncertainties. And then ran the analysis, multiple times. We used Crystal Ball, but any sort of forecasting or simulation program would work. So you run the simulation, 10,000 times, right? The determination, or in this case, the probability function of determining how likely a crash and sort of outcome would be it's simply a mathematical equation, as is the case for many alternative analyses. So you can sort of put that mathematical equation into a spreadsheet, add in your probability distributions and run it 10,000 times to see what the overall outcome would be. Next slide. So this is just an example of some of the input distributions. So like at the top, one concern was for hybrid vehicles because they've got these 300-volt batteries or thereabouts that have a lot of energy, right? So if that has a crash and a short, it's going to ignite whatever can be ignited. All right, so we determined sort of how likely it is that vehicles would have a 300-volt battery or some of these other things, and those were used as inputs to the analysis. And then on the next slide, I just show the outcome. And again, people who've done this sort of analysis, this will be familiar. Here we're looking at the probability of an ignition event due to having that flammable refrigerant available. And what's shown kind of in the green with the arrows that you can maybe slightly see, or the bracket you can see, is the 95% confidence range on the outcome of our assessment, right? And again, you could see this being used for an AA as well. And the fact that we did this gave the regulators great confidence in the overall conclusions, right? They were able to feel that we had really explored some of these uncertainties. In addition, the stakeholders involved really got great satisfaction that their views were addressed, right? They could point to a certain part of this distribution and say, that's what our position suggests, and it's not so different than what the sort of median value would be. So that was useful. And so as a result of this analysis, the replacement refrigerants were accepted and are currently in use. Again, with the CO2, its technical limitations have really limited how much is actually in use in the marketplace, but the 1234YF is currently, I think, used in about 70 million vehicles in the US. So again, this analysis really did sort of take us to implementing an alternative. And again, my point is that I think this could easily be used to sort of score a set of different alternatives in an AA. And the next slide, which is the last slide, just kind of shows how that might work. So, if you think about, for example, the simultaneous decision framework under the IC2 guidance, you've got your different modules, hazard, performance, exposure, et cetera, and you've got a weighting variable associated with each of those, right? And so if we were to use that in some sort of probabilistic analysis, we could assign distributions or probability distributions to each of those variables. And for example, I think that might allow us to understand how uncertain we are about cost and how uncertain we are about hazard. But by looking at the weighting variables, we could also determine kind of how much those uncertainties are important relative to one another, right? We may not care as much about uncertainties in cost as we do about uncertainties in hazard. So again, I think this could be a really useful analysis. That being said, I guess I want to leave you with just a couple of cautions. Certainly assigning distributions itself is uncertain, right? You have to basically use expert judgment to determine what those uncertainties would be. I guess I would argue that having some sort of a distribution is better. Some acknowledgement of uncertainty is better than simply having a point value. So there's, I think, still some value there, but it is something that has to be explained. I think maybe also there's a concern that having some fancy computer analysis, right, can be hard to explain. And one of the goals of AA is transparency. I also think it can over-instill confidence in the results. So again, I think people, even if you do this sort of analysis, you need to think about it critically. And then finally, coming back to this idea of risk assessment and AA, I think the idea was that maybe 15 years ago, probabilistic risk assessment was kind of the thing we were all going to start doing, right? And that never actually happened. And I think, there are a number of reasons why that might be. It is more complicated. It's certainly more expensive. And also, I think the confusing factor is something that really played into that. So, I don't know if this has, if this is something that could be implemented for every AA, but I think it is something worth discussing. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Hey, Tom, thank you very much for that. I really liked the closing points that you made. It was very interesting to see how you could apply your uncertainty analysis, not just to kind of the metrics for the performance criteria, but also when there's uncertainties about where various stakeholders might be in terms of how much value they place on each of these. That was a really interesting point. The other thing that struck me about this presentation is it seems like while it's very quantitative, as you point out, it can also be kind of a trigger for more deeply reflective discussions among stakeholders. Because one, it makes them really think about the range of uncertainty and also how much they value various things. And then two, it can be used as a starting point for discussion at the, after you create these probability distributions, right? That it doesn't end there. It's what I'm hearing you say, that's really the starting point to then have conversations about what do we do about uncertainty.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, for example, in this case, I think what we realized were that sort of human factors inputs were things that were highly uncertain, right? So as Martin sort of alluded to, we can't really predict what people might do. People use things in sort of, improper ways often, or they, react differently to situations. So I think this analysis prompted us to actually get some human factors people involved to really kind of give additional input on those particular aspects, which were, seemed to be highly uncertain.
Thanks, Tom. And in passing, before we go on to our next panelist, I'll just point out for those of you who are keeping score on the National Research Council's lists of ways to deal with uncertainty, this would seem to fit nicely within their suggestion that in appropriate circumstances, you could use quantitative analytical approaches to help with decision making, right? So our panelists are kind of walking us through this set of strategies that the National Research Council had laid out. So more on that later. Thanks very much, Tom. And
Sure,
now we're going to
pleasure.
move on. Our next speaker is Shari Branjevic. I hope I got that right, Shari. And Shari serves as terrific. She serves as the Green Screen Project Manager for Clean Production Action. And Shari leads the design and implementation of the Green Screen tools, which we're going to hear about in a second, and also sets strategic decision for the Green Screen program. So Shari, it's your floor.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm gonna kind of switch gears a little bit. As a tools developer, I'm gonna talk a little bit about how uncertainty can get baked into different strategies. And specifically for me, it's gonna be around hazard assessment and the green screen for safer chemicals. Next slide. I'm just going to start out by introducing my organization and the methodology, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which uncertainty comes into the methodology and the decision making. Clean Production Action, our organization, is a nonprofit organization based out of Boston in the US, and our mission is to design and deliver strategic solutions in the areas of safer chemicals, sustainable materials, and environmentally preferable products. And we do that through two key strategies. One is through collaborations, and the other is through tools development. These are our four key programs. I'm going to focus on the one in the center, Green Screen for Safer Chemicals. Green Screen for Safer Chemicals is a standardized and comprehensive chemical hazard assessment methodology. It was published in 2007, and it is really designed to support comparison of chemicals and selection of chemicals. In terms of how it relates to alternatives assessment, clearly it fits in the hazard assessment portion. Next slide. Very briefly, I'm going to describe the methodology at a very high level for those of you less familiar. So Green Screen includes an evaluation of 18 human and environmental health endpoints. These should look familiar. We like to consider it sort of a standard suite of hazard endpoints, consistent with other regulatory and scientific frameworks. Each of these hazard endpoints then has a set of criteria for evaluating the hazard and classifying it or giving it a level, typically high, moderate, or low. Most of the criteria, where relevant, are harmonized with international precedent, and here largely rely on the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. There are some modifications and nuances to that, but in addition, there are a few hazard endpoints that aren't covered by such schemes that are included, such as endocrine activity and then persistence and bioaccumulation as independent endpoints. Next slide. The assessment is done. It's done by typically a toxicology firm that's licensed to conduct the assessment. And at its core, Green Screen has always been based on all available data and information. So the idea being that you use the best available information that you have to make an informed decision. So assessors will look at measured data. They'll look at various types of read across. They'll look at model data. They'll look at, in vivo, in vitro, et cetera, and use their professional judgment. When they assign the hazard classification, it gets summarized in this, what we call the hazard summary table. And the hazard levels are indicated by a letter and a color. And it gives you a way of getting an overall sense of the hazard profile of the chemical at a single glance. Next slide. The other piece that's built into the methodology is a decision logic. And this is where all of those hazard levels and hazard endpoints get combined in various ways with another set of criteria to define a benchmark score or a single rolled up score that represents the overall hazard profile of that chemical. And again, the entire method, including the benchmark scoring, was really created by looking at national and international precedent. So the benchmark 1 is aligned with a lot of regulatory frameworks and authoritative scientific frameworks for what is considered a chemical of high concern that we want to avoid, chemicals that are PBTs and CMRs, an equivalent concern, for example. And then the framework also has, this stepwise up to low hazard across the board. And the method was developed in consultation with experts from around the world. It's gone through peer review and a number of updates as well. Next slide. So in thinking about, how uncertainty, I think there's a couple of different questions. One, from a tools developer perspective, one question is, how do we communicate uncertainty? And then another question is, then how do we make decisions with the uncertainty that we have? And so I'm going to talk about each of these two elements from the perspective of what's baked into the method. But I think there's a third piece that I'm going to talk about briefly at the end, which is, there's also uncertainty in interpreting the data and looking at the amount of data that's present and how to handle that in terms of assigning classification. So to start with here, in terms of communicating uncertainty, I would say that transparency is really a foundational principle for green screen, and that's a big way in which we communicate uncertainty. In terms of selecting chemicals, there are a series of ways of looking at, for example, minimum data requirements and how that starts to impact the scoring scheme, which could impact decision making. And finally, we have a representation of the confidence in the hazard classification. So I'm gonna go through each of these. Next slide. In terms of transparency, one thing that's really important is that data gaps are very clearly indicated. You see in the hazard summary table that the data gap is displayed in a very unique way, so it's easily picked up. In the green screen, there's a clear definition of what a data gap means, and it is the assessor has to go through a series of steps using all available data and information that I spoke about earlier before assigning a data gap. And the steps that they take, there's another level of transparency. So it's not just the hazard summary table, but there's an entire report that the assessor puts out. And in that report, they will document what steps they took to try and fill that data gap and why, for example, oh, well, we tried this type of modeling tool, but it was outside of the scope of that model, et cetera. So they would have information about why an analog or model wasn't sufficient to help fill that data gap. Next slide. The second piece, and this is around transparency, but also around decision making, is that as the assessor is doing the assessment, they not only determine the level of concern for that hazard endpoint, but they also assign a level of confidence. And the level of confidence is going to be an overall indication of how certain they are about that classification. So a high confidence classification, oftentimes that means that there's, really robust data, and it may be a single really well conducted and well documented study with really clear outcomes. It could be that it's a body of evidence that's all concordant, all pointing in the same direction. Low confidence, conversely, you have situations where you're data poor, maybe the study wasn't well conducted, the doses weren't well selected, it wasn't well documented, or you have a body of evidence that's discordant. It's pointing in a lot of different directions. So this information is also very clearly depicted in the hazard summary table and in the documentation, where the assessor will list how they determine their rationale for their level of confidence. Next slide. The second piece that's kind of baked into the decision making, we have this overall score, or the benchmark score for an individual chemical. And we have minimum data requirements to meet each of these different bins or bars. And the data requirements increase as the levels go up. So there's a higher burden of evidence to demonstrate that something is safer versus that something is more hazardous. Next slide. And those data requirements play out into the benchmark scoring, which some people use as a pretty high level first step in decision making is, where does this fall on the spectrum? And so if a chemical based on known hazards would be assigned a benchmark 3, which is fairly high, but it's missing some basic data, it would be bumped down to a benchmark 2. And in that case, it would carry the subscript DG back to transparency, again, speaking about how data gaps are driving that score. And in the write-up with the rationale, it would talk about what data gaps were driving that score. And if it has even more data gaps, it could be even downgraded to a benchmark U unspecified, meaning that we believe it doesn't even have a sufficiently basic data set. This is always considering all available data and information. So this is analogs, models, et cetera. But if it doesn't even have enough information to characterize, then it would be a benchmark U. Next slide. So the highest level of decision making in green screen is that benchmark score, but we do always encourage users to look deeper. And we have defined some very data requirements that are very general data requirements for all chemicals, but each situation may be different, and so there can be user defined minimum data requirements as well. So as an example, if you have a chemical of concern, and it came out as a benchmark 1, and then you're looking at a series of alternatives, you would be looking at that hazard summary table as well to compare those alternatives. And in this case, perhaps if your chemical of high concern is it's an endocrine disrupting chemical, perhaps in that case, you would determine that a data gap for endocrine activity is unacceptable, particularly if the structure is similar to the chemical that it's replacing and may have biological similarities as well. The other piece that I'm showing down on the bottom here is that you can also use this level of confidence in the hazard score for key hazard endpoints to determine, in your decision making that could influence what you select and choose. Next slide. The last piece I wanted to touch on really briefly is, interpreting the data. So we all know that assessors are looking at data sets, and as Tim mentioned earlier in the talk, that you can have a chemical that's very data rich, or you could have very data poor chemicals. And so how do you think about uncertainty and with the data that you have? And in addition, we all know that we're moving away from these guideline in vivo animal studies, and so moving towards these NAMs and non-animal test methods. And so how do we think about that in terms of uncertainty? And I think in terms of a method developer perspective, we have a few different ways that we think about it. One of them is, how do we provide more guidance for assessors such that they can use some of these maybe non-guideline studies, some other modeling data, et cetera, to come to conclusions. And so not only do we point to external resources for how to interpret that data with the uncertainty, but also developing guidance to guide the assessors as well through global experts and peer review. And finally, there are situations where, two chemicals are assessed the exact same data sets, and assessors come up with a different conclusion based on the uncertainty of how you interpret that data, based on, what is your standard of evidence to assign a score, based on study design or interpretation of ambiguous evidence. And so in these cases, we involve external expert panels to come in and weigh in on those decisions to try and come to a harmonized conclusion. And so I would say that, just in wrapping up, I think there are a number of ways in which method developers can bake in strategies around uncertainty. And at the same time, some of the pieces that, Martin spoke about your overall mission as an organization, your framing, and all these other elements of values can also come into the data interpretation or into how you deal with uncertainty. All right, with that, happy to be a part of the discussion, and thank you again.
Wow, thank you so much, Sherry. So much texture in there, lots to dig into. And hey, can I ask you, Molly, can you put us all up there in a second? Can we get the panel all together virtually? And here's what I'd like to do, folks. We've already got a bunch of questions from the chat. So we're going to take those in a second. I have one question I want to ask the panel as a whole. And let's, if we can, just a reminder, there are the questions we'd like everybody, participants and panelists, to be thinking about. They're also in the chat. But if I can ask you, Molly, could you remove that screen share so that we can get a good look at our panelists? There they are. All right, terrific. So here's what I'd like to do. I have a question for the panel that I'm going to ask. And in the meantime, while I'm asking that, we're chatting. If there's any other questions from the audience, either drop it in the chat or put that little blue hand up, and we'll keep an eye on that. But panelists, here's the question I have for you. And I guess maybe this is a question I should have asked at the outset. If I had students here, they would probably be chastising me for failing to do that. And that is, maybe we should get clear about our definitions here when we talk about uncertainty. So I was listening to the three panelists, and I counted many different types of uncertainty, and Shari's presentation in particular really highlighted this point, right? So we're talking about data gaps in the kind of context of actual data gaps, right? No data, right? And then there's conflicting data, all sorts of different kinds of uncertainty. Can I go around the horn here with the panelists? And can you tell us what you think of when somebody uses the word uncertainty, and just comment perhaps on, are there different kinds of uncertainties that you approach in different ways? Is that a fair question? I guess it doesn't matter if it's fair because I just asked it. We're going to have to follow up on it. So, and while the panelists are giving it a bit of thought, I'm going to chatter a little bit, just to give them a little bit of time to think about that question. But also, let me just encourage folks to drop their questions in the chat or show us their blue hand. So panelists, what is uncertainty? And if there are different variations on it, any general rules about how to approach those different types? Is there anybody who would like to lead us off? Tom?
Yeah, I'm happy. I mean, I guess I like to think of, uncertainty as kind of having, I think from my perspective, at least two parts. And one of those is variability, right? I mean, so you don't know exactly what the value is. It could be between this and it could be between that. And maybe you kind of have a general sense of, what the median is or something like that. And then there is really lack of knowledge, right? Which is, we don't even know what the value is, right? We have no data to support that. And so I think, to me, those are kind of the two things that fall under and I guess the second one is like truly uncertainty. So I suppose under the heading of uncertainty, I have like variability and then real uncertainty. And I guess, do I approach them differently? I mean, I guess with things that are related to variability, I can kind of put bounds in it, right? I can do the same thing with sort of things that I don't have data on. I suppose it's a more uncertain process, right? Because I'm just kind of guessing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So so when you talk about variability, I mean, those are things like more data isn't really going to help us with that in terms of there's inherent variability in terms of like just how the real world operates, how it works?
I mean, like everything, it's all a matter of gradation. But I mean, I think you're right. More data won't help unless it's due to not great data, and I can get better data, right? More conclusive data, better design data that can help nail that down. Or the weight of evidence thing, right? If I do 5 more studies, do I have a better confidence in what my mean value might be?
All right, terrific. Can we hear from other folks on the panel? What do you think of when you think of uncertainty, and what do you do about it? Martin?
So I consider uncertainty a lack of predictability. We use data to build models, and we'd like to think if we put one set of values into a model, we'll get a single result out that is an expression of the characteristic of the model. But frequently, regardless of the amount of data we have, the model is such that the result is ambiguous. And this could be because of uncertainty in measurement. It could be because of lack of data to enter into the model. It could be because the model itself is incapable of reaching a precise solution. So anything that leads to a lack of predictability, or in mathematical terms, any nonlinear system produces uncertainty.
Okay. I mean, in the law, we tend to think about uncertainty as there's kind of gambling uncertainty, right? There's just probabilities. There's no actual value. There's a distribution of value. So then we tend to think about that as kind of almost like, it's probability, it's gambling. Whereas we think about epistemic uncertainty. That is, there's a lack of knowledge, and it's either because we can't get that knowledge because of other constraints, or that there is no knowledge to be gotten. So these would be with issues like how important is a particular performance criteria. There's no answer, you go out and get that, right? It is more a question of, we're dealing with subjective or qualitative concerns, values, right? And I liked, Tom, in your presentation about trying to address that kind of uncertainty, as well as the kind of what we might call scientific or, probabilistic uncertainty. So interesting. Yeah, Martin, and then let's go to Shari and get her input, because you've obviously clearly thought about different ways of thinking about, because you're talking about data gaps, confidence in data sets, those sorts of things. So you've clearly kind of thought through these different types. Martin, I saw your hand go up. Let's hear from you. And then Shari, I'd love to hear your viewpoints on uncertainty.
Yeah, I just wanted to go to the opposite of uncertainty and talk about certainty, and address an issue that Tom raised, that frequently we have models where you can put in your variables and get a very specific output. So it would seem to be highly certain. And I bring up the term GIGO, which is used with computers, gospel or garbage in, garbage out. But frequently it's gospel in, garbage out, or I said that wrong. It's garbage in, gospel out, where you put in a lot of data and a lot of bad data, and get a specific answer, and people take it as gospel, even though it is highly, not necessarily uncertain, but sometimes just downright wrong.
Okay. So Shari, you want to chime in here on what is uncertainty? And then we're going to go to this, we've got a very vibrant discussion in chat, so we'll go to some of these questions next.
Yeah, happy to weigh in. I think, when I think about uncertainty, I think about, cases where there's ambiguity. And I think, with alternatives assessment, this is about making decisions. Is this thing better? And at the end of the day, you have to make this choice. And there's a set of ambiguity. And the ambiguity, like we're talking about, could be you're making a choice where you have incomplete information. It could be that you're making a choice where you have discordant information. It could be that you're making a choice where you have trade-offs, or you're making this choice where there's values that are different. So I think, there is the strategy of addressing this ambiguity. There could be cases where it's really about getting more data. Like, how do we get better data to answer these questions? Because there's a lack of information, or a lack of well-conducted studies, or a lack of, modeling that actually has the scope of this uncertainty in it. But I think there's also places where you know, this discordance of data, like what is your standard of evidence in order to make that choice? And then also, how do the values drive into that? So what are your values, as Martin talked about? You know, we're going to use a precautionary approach and maybe their standard of evidence is much higher. So that plays into how you make your choice given that ambiguity.
So excellent point about, and we saw it made in the chat, excellent point that the approach to uncertainty has to fit the context, and that context is just not a scientific decision. It's also a decision driven by the mission and culture of the particular decision maker or their organization, which I think is an important point. One other thing we saw in the chat along these lines, Larry Brown points out that, you know, most assessment looks at individual chemicals. One of the places where we see a lot of uncertainty is in mixtures, right? Whether those are mixtures in given products or whether those are mixtures that occur in ambient exposures. There's clearly a lot of data uncertainty in those circumstances as well. Okay, so let me go and call on some of the folks who had questions or comments they wanted to make. We're gonna start with Lauren. And Lauren, would you please turn on your video? And Molly, if you could spotlight Lauren, let's hear what Lauren has to say.
Hi, everybody. Oops, I think my video is on. Nope, there we go. I have a special NSA protection cover on my screens. Yeah, thank you for the excellent talks. Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking also about how in an AA, sometimes a small amount of uncertainty is enough to drive users not to accept an alternative. And sometimes that's not the case. I think about, say, a boat paint. There are cases when, methods can't be too rigid. If they're rigid, then there may not be applicable to the context. For example, looking at the boat paint alternatives assessment that Northwest Green Chemistry did, some of the lesser hazard chemicals were actually more relevant because there was a lot of exposure, say, during the painting of a boat. And so in that context, some of the more rigid systems for evaluating hazard or cost and things like that really weren't applicable within the context of the AA. So I think it's important that we use our tools with some flexibility, because in these cases, you want them to really be relevant to how the product is used and across the full life cycle. That's really, and I think you were touching on that, Tim, as well. So there's a need for some flexibility, but also there's an interesting dichotomy between the values that people have and their willingness to accept uncertainty. And I know in the boat paint AA, most of the performance testing was, it was not convincing enough to people to make a switch. And that was problematic. And so I think sometimes there's a very high bar. And so I think I just would maybe ask this panelist to address, I think the idea of transparency is very important, but how do you really make sure that the metrics you're using are really tied to the context of what you're assessing, and also how do you build in a little bit of flexibility for preference? Maybe there's multiple good options. How do you give some flexibility in what people will choose to advance the greater good? So that's a little general, but maybe something will spark. I see Tom smiling. Maybe something sparks some thoughts there.
Tom, is that sparking coming out of your head?
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know. Mostly it was just the thought of seeing Lauren again. It's sort of, it's a nice experience, but we haven't talked for quite a long time. I mean, I guess it does, I appreciate it. And I guess, I think one of the points you're making is you don't want the uncertainty to be a barrier to sort of accepting an alternative, right? That shouldn't be kind of where you stop, right? It's too uncertain, we can't do anything. I mean, I think, one possible way of addressing that is to, and I hesitate to say this, but to basically look at things multiple ways, right? I mean, that increases the sort of scope of your A and makes it more complicated and you have to explain more. But, I'm thinking actually, Tim, of the work we did at UCLA. So this was just recently published. There was sort of a decision workshop at UCLA that Tim co-hosted with a number of other people, including myself. And, one of the conclusions was that certain approaches that allowed people to so we had a group of stakeholders, and certain approaches that allowed people to play with the variables and sort of see, like, if we weighted this more, this would be the outcome. If we weighted this more, that would be the outcome. I think that might be a good way to address some of these concerns. I mean, then, is performance, being if we weight performance a little less, for example, does that make these alternatives more acceptable? And then, in the context of the broader decision making, does that maybe help you reach a decision?
Right. I was thinking of the same thing in your session, Tim, at the Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference a couple of years ago, where you could actually visualize that. If you weighted environmental values more, you would see different results than if you rated cost or performance. I'm sorry, go ahead. You're going to say
no, I was just going to say, this is really interesting because I think what we could tease out of this conversation, maybe some principles about making decisions, about the kind of approach to take. So for example, I heard from Martin's talk, and then Lauren, from some of the points you made, that having a clear notion about what your mission is, what's important to your particular organization, the culture of your organization, right? Those things tell us something about how much uncertainty you're willing to accept in making the decision. That is clear, I think. The other is, Tom, coming out of from some of the stuff that you've said, I think can also be drawn from Sherry's emphasis on transparency, that a lot of times the use of uncertainty analyses, if you're involved in consensus building, if that's what you're trying to do, then things like the tools you're talking about, Tom, where you can visualize stuff, use this probability distributions as ways for people to see where the differences are and which ones matter. That's a very useful tool to use there. And then I think another aspect which is important is, what is the context you're in? If you're in a regulatory context, there may be other kinds of drivers or constraints. And I think we have a couple of commenters, questioners in the chat room that I'd like to call on to address this issue. So Hiram, I had you in, you had some interesting things to say in the chat, and we'd asked you, could you tell us a little bit more about your thinking there? There he is.
Good afternoon. So my name is Hiram Moerman. I'm from Belgium. So my context is a European context, more specifically the context of a regulatory context. Now the questions you asked triggered my mind to see what do we do here in Europe to handle uncertainty using chemical substances with their hazards. First of all, I like to distinguish between the different fields on which uncertainty can play. First of all, you have the hazard properties themselves. We have the exposure where there can be uncertainty. This one was discussed already by the seventh generation presentation. But you also have uncertainty on the impact of using the substance on all kinds of other fields, such as the socioeconomical impact. What will happen if you use one or the other alternative? And in that context, I remember a statement of yesterday's presentations from 4A, where a gentleman said, well, ultimately, the customer has a choice. If the performance is less than the original, the customer will take the original, so the alternative has too much of a chance. So uncertainty on that field can be very, very harsh on consequences. But let's say these are the typical aspects where uncertainty is considered in alternative assessment. But also, I appreciate Lauren's contribution in the sense that also other elements such as hot topics in Europe as climate change and circular economy, these can be assessed in alternative assessment as well. And these are the kind of methodologies we are trying to develop to assess these three elements of sustainability in one go. Only 3 of the 17 SDG goals, but that's already very challenging. But basically how we do this to handle these uncertainties. On the hazard part, I think that what has been done in Europe by collecting all the hazard data from about 40,000 substances now in a database, have this publicly available, have this scrutinized by authorities, additional testing being asked, etc., has through the data collection and the transparency resolved a lot of uncertainty issues to the extent that now we can, with fairly high level of certainty, distinguish between substances which are very toxic, the SVHCs, the substances of very high concern, that bucket, and the rest. So the option which Europe took was, let's the big fish from the small fish. Let's distinguish those first, and let's focus on the big fish, but we identify the big fish with a high level of certainty through data collection and stakeholders consultations. Everybody had to say to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. We are agreeing that those substances are of concern. And I think if you don't have this in alternative assessment, if this ground is still loose, if you're still discussing hazard and you're going to try to go into alternative assessment, you are on very loose ground. Then the second level of uncertainty in those alternative assessments is the exposure part. And there I fully support the notion, more data, more certainty. Models are very good, but models are, well, there were some quotes on the chat box, also as good as they are. The more data you have, the more data that is transparently collected and reported, the better you'll be on uncertainty on the exposure level. The impact is most of the time the delicate thing, because the impact is something which can only be correctly assessed by the companies themselves and heavily disputed by authorities. And there, the approach that Tom already proposed, the sensitivity analysis, is the one which is required mandatorily in the regulations to be done when alternatives are assessed for a substance of very high concern. So a sensitivity analysis needs to be done to compare the situation where the substance is used, continue to be used, versus the situation that the substance is no longer used. So those two scenarios need to be evaluated and monetized, basically, because that's the goal. And a sensitivity analysis needs to be done on these two scenarios. And it is this that should build the confidence to the regulator to judge whether or not the story, because basically it's a story, the story that the applicant to continue to use a substance of very high concern has a case, or he does not have a case and he does not have the justification to continue to use the substance. So it's a very regulatory framework. You have to convince the regulator of your case. And sensitivity analysis is certainly one piece of the game, but of course the other piece is that you want to have the two scenarios as wide apart as you can by minimizing basically your risks and not exaggerating your costs, but having real credible scenarios for your cost analysis in case you have an unused scenario. So that's my 5 cents of experience we had from this side of the pond on this topic.
Well, thanks very much. It's always good to get that kind of perspective, both from a regulatory standpoint and also from, not just focused on the United States, seeing what's happening globally. Boy, I wish we had more time. We have a little bit of time left. I've got time for one more question. There's a terrific amount of good information on the chat, so I invite you to go take a look at that. But next, I want to go to Sally Edwards. She raised a question that I think I'd like to hear what the panelists have to say. So Molly, can we highlight Sally and hear Sally's question about the intersection of uncertainty and concerns about environmental justice? There you are. Hi, Sally.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and this is such an important topic. But whenever we have this discussion, I'm brought back to how do we take this from the abstract to the real? And I think back to a study that I did with NRDC a few years ago that Bina Singla led on, and it was to look at decision making, alternatives assessment in vulnerable populations, and we interviewed leaders in the environmental justice movement. When we're talking about trade-offs, and so I wanted to ask the panel, how do you weight uncertainty when the decision could really impact a population that's already been disproportionately impacted by toxic chemicals. And I think it's something we really need to wrestle with, because in particular, it's so relevant to what we're dealing with in the world right now, that we cannot continue to, if we want our work to really make a difference in making a more just world, we really need to be thinking about this in the research that we do and in the sort of practical applications of our work.
Shari, we haven't heard from Shari yet, I think, so far. So I'd like to start. Shari, make sure you get your chance to provide input.
Sure. Thanks, Sally, so much for bringing up this question. And, I think that one of the things that we think about, and of course, we're in the context of a hazard frame, but one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is how do we make sure that we're taking the entire life cycle into consideration? Because oftentimes the vulnerable populations are exposed either during manufacturing or during end of life. And so, there are frameworks where, looking just at the use phase, something might not be hazardous or but somewhere in its life cycle it is. And so how do we raise up and how do we prioritize the entire life cycle and not just the use phase, I think is one of the strategies that's important in thinking about tending to vulnerable populations.
All right, thank you, Shari. Martin, and then we'll go to Tom to close out our discussion in this question.
So there's a difference between uncertainty and what I'll call ignorance. Certainly, there may be tremendous uncertainty in the particular impacts that a product or a particular substance will have, but you can still understand what trends will occur as different segments of the population are exposed to that. And while you might not have certainty about the value of the impact, the directionality. And I think Hiram has made this point that we need to adjust our models to account for that change, that variability in impact, even if we don't have absolute certainty about what that impact is. We have the directional understanding. A vulnerable population is children under 5. The example I used is focused on that because they were the ones that were disproportionately impacted by this particular product. So I think it's important to take this into account and not simply look at the mean in a population, but to also look at the tails of a population to see how they're impacted.
Thanks, Martin, for the answer and for alerting me to that. Tom?
Sure. I'll try to make this really quick because I know we're running out of time. I mean, I think that certainly, maybe I can speak of this from the standpoint of this California Safer Consumer Products regulation. I know we have DTSC people on the phone, but certainly in terms of what products you're looking at, there's sort of a provision there for looking at vulnerable groups in terms of, when an AA would be required. And there are provisions in that regulation for looking at the sort of public health impacts and environmental impacts, which could also include, particularly vulnerable groups. And, I think like if you talk about children as a group, maybe the data there are a little easier. If we're talking about, specific communities, I mean, I think one of the limitations I think we have is, where do we actually get the data for that sort of addresses that group particularly, right? I think that, lack of data is a problem when we're trying to do some of these things, when we're trying to address some of these populations.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Tom. I have some thoughts on that as well, but I'm going to mute myself this time, given the fact that it's 9:30 and we do need to let folks, go about their life. Thank you, panelists, for a terrific set of presentations and thoughtful comments on it. And thank you to the participants for the questions. There's a number I wasn't able to get to. I apologize for that. I invite everybody to go and take a quick look at the chat because there's some really terrific stuff in there. So anyway, thanks everybody. Really appreciate everything. And we'll see you in the next session. So long now.